We have a wonderful panel for you now, and this is the panel where we talk about how Iran has evolved as a society and politically. Some of that was addressed in the very first panel, but we're going to delve much more deeply into the reality of Iran today, because I think it's rare in Washington that you have people who have real experience in the country and recent experience in the country. So first, with great pleasure and pride, I want to introduce Haleh Esfandiari, who is my personal mentor, if I may say, in this whole arena of Iran. She is the former and founding director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and I have tried very hard to model the programs that we do at the Atlantic Council on the excellent work that she did at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So first, Haleh. Then we are very lucky to have an up-and-comer, as we say, Haleh Dagres. She's a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Security Initiative at our Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council. But more importantly for me, we work together on our IranSource blog. Haleh is our primary editor for the IranSource blog. Those of you who want to write blog posts, you can send your emails to Haleh. And we have collected outside in a booklet 10 pieces that we commissioned in connection with this event, and I hope you'll read them and find them of interest. Haleh wrote one of them, I wrote one of them, Haleh wrote one of them. Mohammad, you did not. He's the guilty one, but he wrote a book recently, so he's allowed. And then finally, on our panel, we have Mohammad Tabaar, who's an associate professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. I have listened to him over the years. He used to be at GW, and I used to come in and listen to you then. He's written a wonderful new book called Religious Statecraft, which I think really peels away the veil in terms of the role of Islam in Iran currently and the role of politics in Islam in Iran. And the two are not necessarily the same, and we're going to talk about it. But I wanted to start with Haleh and talk about the role of women in Iran, which historically has been so important. It was very important clearly before the revolution, and in some ways it may be even more important after the revolution than it was before. How do you see the status of women in Iran now? I know that I've seen some commentary that, well, Iran was great for women of the elite before the revolution, educated women, wealthy women, but, for your ordinary woman in the street, perhaps not so great. And that the revolution has made it better in some sense for the lower classes, while obviously not so great for the elite. So how do you see the role of women in Iran today?
Barbara, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a joy to be with you and Mohsen, who has been an old friend, and a lot of other friends here. And I discovered that the deputy director of your Middle East program got her first internship with the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. So it was wonderful to see her too. Let me start with disagreeing with the notion and concept that the changes that were introduced under the previous regime for women were only changes for the elite. Iran had one of the most progressive family protection law, which was the best after Tunisia and the first in the Middle East. When the law passed, you might be interested, the law was drafted by the Women's Organization of Iran with the help of some parliamentarian. But the then Minister of Justice, Mr. Javad Sadr, took the text, went to Najaf, to Ayatollahi, presented it to him, and he said, this is what we are going to launch. And he spent 2 days explaining all the different articles and convincing Ayatollah Khoei that this is good for all women. And among the strong points of the family protection law was, first of all, raising the age of marriage for girls, first from 13 to 15 and then to 18, and for men to 21. Number 2, women could go to the family courts, which were by then set up, and seek a divorce. You know, the court would decide, but nevertheless, a woman had the right to go there. So men lost the unilateral right of divorcing their wife and just notifying them by mail. So that was taken out completely. And child custody was also given to the mother in case of divorce, unless the mother was not capable of looking after the children. So these were very important issues. And I remember working with the Women's Organization of Iran when the law passed. And the Women's Organization of Iran had set up welfare centers in less affluent places in Tehran and other Iranian cities, precisely to educate those women. Fast forward to after the revolution, one of the first decisions of Ayatollah Khomeini was to suspend the family protection law. And there was a barrage of letters from ordinary women, you know, to the office of Ayatollah Montazeri and the office of Ayatollah Khomeini, saying, look, we lost the right to get a divorce. Our husband can now marry as many as 4 wives, and the age of marriage was lowered to 9 for girls. So from 18 to 9, which is puberty in Islam. So it was those women. And what struck me was that the elite women, I remember on one of my trips to Iran, I was asking around, how do you feel about the family protection law now that it has been suspended? So we could then, the answer I got was that we could then our divorce then and we could get our divorce now. So if that was the case, but it wasn't the case for the, you know, the mass of Iranian women. So I think some of these changes really was beneficiary across the board to all sorts of, to all classes of women.
In terms of where women are now and their role in protests in Iran, I mean, from the very first days, and Haleh's written a wonderful piece, which you can read about the history of the movement. They came out on International Women's Day, right, after the revolution.
Yeah. March
and against the reimposition of the veil. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at their role, if you could perhaps just talk a little bit about all of the protests that have taken place that have been spearheaded by women.
Yeah. March 8, 1979 was the first big protest in Tehran. And women came out and walked to the office of Prime Minister Bazargan. And later on, I was told by somebody who happened to be with Bazargan, he was shell-shocked when they told him there are several thousand women outside your gates asking, protesting the imposition of the veil, which the poor guy didn't have anything to do with. It was the decision of Ayatollah Khomeini. You know, I mean, he truly didn't know what to do. But then, within a matter of maybe half an hour, they were thugs sent into the streets of Kach and that whole surrounding, and they started beating up these women, chasing these women, and repeating a slogan that some of you who know Persian and remember the abolition of the veil, which was then Yarusari, Yatusari. So when they came back, this time, again, they were saying, either you wear a veil or we are going to slap you. So the same thing, you are to sari. So that, you know, so, and this continued. And I think, as I mentioned in the piece, women started finding their way. Yeah. You know, it took a year or two to then be mobilized. And then they started speaking out, you know, pushing for more right. Another of their achievement was that immediately after the revolution, they were barred from certain field of education. And it just so happened that Mrs. Rahnavard, who is now persona non grata for God knows how many years now, and under house arrest, the wife of former Prime Minister Mousavi, she was instrumental to fighting in the High Committee for Education to reinstate, you know, those fields that women were barred from. So women could once again study law, women could study agriculture, and so on. And I think what also happened was the access to education. I mean, the Islamic on the eve of the revolution, it wasn't as if you didn't have any girls from the less affluent classes going to school. There were 2 million girls in schools. That was on the eve of the revolution. But then, you know, there are those who argue that families, because it was an Islamic republic, trusted the government more to send their children, their daughters, to school. And so, you know, education was, you had equal access to education for girls and for boys, and the girls made a lot of, you know, progress and took advantage of this possibility. And again, as you know, in the last couple of years, the entering numbers at universities are more for girls than for boys. And Iran was the only country, I think, as far as I know, that discussed the possibility of introducing quotas for men when it comes to education, you know. But it died in parliament. But that was it. So you had parallel with that, then there was a lot of resistance to the veil. You know, I remember the first time I went back to Iran after the revolution, the streets were a sea of navy blue, black, and a dull brown of big, loose coats and the scarf. If you go today, if you look at the street of Tehran, there is a skimpy piece of cloth, if at all, on the girl's hair. And there are these very tight and very short and colorful robes. I remember, as a friend of mine on my last trip in Iran said, really, it's sick to look at you with your loose big manto. I'm going to, everybody will notice you are coming from abroad, because nobody in Iran was up. So she brought me as a present a manto. I looked at the, you know, I looked at the tag and I said, it says extra large. I said, extra large? That's not possible. I said, okay, thank you. I wore it, I could barely close the button. So that was the extra large thing, you know.
That's funny.
Yeah, but then, you know, an awakening has taken place in Iran among the women, and I think thanks to the Islamic Republic, women have become fighters, women push back. I mean, Aryan, you lived in Iran, you know, in the streets of Tehran, whenever somebody tries to stop a woman why she's wearing this or that, or why she's wearing makeup, I mean, they push back, they fight, and my sense is that this generation of women, alongside the younger generation, are going to be the real instrument for change, because it is not only the upper middle class or the elite, it is also conservative women who aspire to these things. They do.
Just a footnote, when we first met, I think it was around 1996, and I was preparing for my first trip to Iran. I got fashion advice from you, so I remember bringing a long gray baggy raincoat and a kind of mud-colored scarf on my first trip. But I also remember meeting women who were part of this sort of Islamist feminist group. Women like Shakla Sherkat,
yes,
women like the daughter of Hashemi Rafsanjani, Faiza Hashemi, who were already pushing back, changing laws, producing publications for women and dealing with women's issues. So, I mean, the fighting back continued and really intensified, I think. Also, if we look at, I mean, one thing Khomeini didn't do, he didn't take the vote away from women. And I think one of the reasons Mohammad Khatami was elected in 1997 was because he got the youth vote, but he very much overwhelmingly got the women's vote.
And Rouhani too.
I'm going to turn to Haleh, who's also lived in Iran more recently, and as a student, as a junior high school student, navigating the restrictions of the Islamic Republic. And Haleh and I first met in 2013, and I went to have dinner with her and her parents. And it was in North Tehran. It was very hot. It was August. And it was dark. It was at night. And she came to greet me. She didn't have a scarf on her head. And I soon realized that even in 2013, most of the women in North Tehran, particularly at night, were not bothering with a scarf. So if you can sort of pick this up, take us forward, not just in terms of dress, but in terms of culture. We talked about some of it with Nazila Fatih this morning. Music, art, all the ways in which society would now be unrecognizable to Ayatollah Khomeini.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to sit next to Dr. Esfandiari. I think just to pick up on the sense of color in mantos, I mean, when I moved to Tehran in 1999, I was in head to toe in black. And by the time I graduated high school in 2005, I was wearing a white manto up to here, and I had my hair sticking out, and I actually had pink highlights. So it was a shock. I mean, I used to joke as a teenager, for every year that passes, the manto and the rusari will go back and get shorter. And I mean, I've tweeted about this on social media. I've seen pictures of girls in Tehran. Right now, the style is that you wear an extremely long manto, but you leave it open. And so there's girls that have been bearing their midriffs. And then if they see somebody coming their way, it's just like, okay. Nobody's going to see that. And again, a lot of people like to talk and say, well, this is just a Tehran thing. But this is happening in Esfahan. This is happening in Shiraz. But it's not just a North Tehran construct in the Islamic Republic. And to put the hijab aside for a moment, I think the bigger thing is that these sort of things are a barometer of change in Iran. Basic things like hearing music in a restaurant or a coffee shop or a hotel. In the 90s, you were lucky to hear My Heart Will Go On by Kenny G. And now you're hearing Cardi B and Rihanna and Adele. I remember when I was in Tehran last in 2013. And for me, every year that I went there was just a shock, because it seemed like there was just a lot being pushed back slowly but surely. And the youth exactly were the same way as well. And I think that we really saw that change start with the presidency of Mohammad Khatami when he was elected in 1997. And that was really when you saw the change. Little things like men wearing ties in the street, a symbol of West toxification, Gharb zadegi. I mean, it was something also forbidden essentially up until the late 1990s. I remember seeing that for the first time. My first note was all the Iranians were dressing up to go see their families. And you're seeing these men with their coat shalvar, their suit and tie, and it's shocking, because all my life I had just seen the Iranian government officials with their very conservative dress. And so what was also very interesting at that time was the role of information technology and how much it's progressed since then. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of satellite dishes, cell phones, and the internet, because these all kind of came together at the same time. satellite dishes in the early 1990s were few and far between. You had maybe a dozen channels at the time. If you had one, it was kind of seen as a status symbol, and it was also a little bit intimidating because you were afraid you were going to get in trouble for having one because they're against the law to have one in your home. And so as time went on, not only did the number increase, and not only did the Iranians not care if they were getting caught. I mean, I've had several instances where they've come to my own family's home and they've taken them away and they go right back up two hours later. And so this is something that wasn't just some North Tehran thing. This was something that I've interviewed satellite dish guys, and they've said that they've gone to clerics' homes, and they've also had homes where the wife will be like, well, block all the sexy channels. And then the wife goes out in the room to bring chai, and the husband's like, well, give me the code so at least I know. And so, and when we talk about satellite dishes, there's over 780 channels that are being sent to Iran right now. Over 180 are Persian language satellite channels, not just Iran International or Manoto Farsi or BBC Persian. They're Persian music channel, PMC. They are MBC Persian. They're watching the latest pop songs, either from within Iran, getting shared from international satellite, or from the diaspora. They're watching the latest movies with Persian subtitles coming from Arab countries. And what was also really fascinating about that by the early 2000s is that Iranians weren't just looking to satellite dishes just to get the news or the pop culture references. Some Iranians were learning English. I had a friend that speaks with a perfect American accent because she had watched so many movies. And it was something that was very daunting, and I think that was very important. But to go take things a step further is the role of the internet and cell phones and how much that's played an important role today in Iranian society. First, I should start with the fact that there are 56 million internet users in Iran. That is the largest cohort in the entire Middle East and North Africa. There are over 40-some million people on social media, despite the fact that there is an electric curtain that blocks Iranians not just from YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. And on top of everything else is the way they've managed to circumvent these tools. They're not just using VPNs, they're using circumvention tools at some times that were actually brought to them by activists abroad during the 2009 post-election protests known as the Green Movement. And that's really when you saw this sense of the Iranian government felt threatened by what the internet had to offer. That was why they went out of their way to start not just a cyber army, but to block a lot of websites up until then that were readily available for Iranians. And I think that was a big time in history in terms of information technology, because we also had cell phones. Cell phones were slowly now taking video. They were able to access social media. And cell phones were being used not just for calls and texts and selfies, but they were used as documentation, as weapons of documentation to document the police brutality, the protests, violations, and they were quickly uploading them online. And we see this still today since the December 2017, January 2018 protests that continue to ebb and flow, that they're constantly resorting to uploading, posting, sharing on resources like Telegram, which is Iran's most popular messaging app. Though it's blocked right now, and the Iranian government has explicitly said that it's illegal to use it, you still find that not only have Iranian government officials continued to use it, but the average Iranian. And they're not just using it for protest use. They're using it to sell items like clothing, teeth whitening, Botox, plastic surgery. They're telling jokes. They're showing the latest Asia Cup stats. And we talk about Iran's international isolation, but the reality is that the Iranian people, though they're internationally isolated, they're not virtually. They are very much in touch with the world. They know probably more about our politics than some of us Americans do. They can name US government leaders predating Carter. They're looking forward to the latest Game of Thrones. The moment it comes online, they're gonna download it and it's gonna be dubbed in Persian. They're already chatting about the excitement. Is the Night King going to come out and turn out to be Bran, if you guys are into Game of Thrones. Like there are actual websites that are with .ir websites that are in tune with this, and Iranians are very much aware of what's happening around them. And I know that here in Washington, we like to coddle them like they're these children that need help, they need saving, essentially. But I think we really underestimate what I would call the indomitable human spirit of the Iranian people, that after 40 years of everything, whether it's revolution, war, sanctions, isolation, repression, that they've been able to overcome so much, and we underestimate their potential, and we belittle them when we sit here and send out Persian language tweets acting like they have no idea that there's corruption going on in their country. And even the taxi driver, I was there in the early 2000s, and he'd be like, you see that building? Excuse me for saying this, but that SOB, Rafsanjani owns that building. I mean, this is not new. The Trump administration is not putting new information out there. They already know these things. And it hurts me to say this, but the belittling of the Iranian people is counterproductive.
Yeah.
And so, yes.
I have to add a couple things. When I first went in '96, and there were satellite dishes, and they were being confiscated, but then people would put them right back out again. And people told me that if it's like 2 o'clock in the morning, Sunday morning, Saturday night, and you see the lights on in an apartment, that means that they're watching the porn channel from Turkey. That was in 1996. So I love the reference to Game of Thrones and so on. And when, on an official level, when you went to Iran 22 years ago, there was no CNN in the hotel room. There was nothing. Only Iranian state television. And my first couple of visits, I would have to physically go to the office of Agence France Presse and read the teletype to find out what had happened in the world that day, because there was no way to know from, Iranian state television. You would go to someone's home and they'd turn on the BBC, and it was like Radio Free Europe in the height of the Cold War in the old Soviet Union. So it's really remarkable. Now we're in Twitter fights every day, Haleh and I, with people in Iran, outside Iran, sharing videos, sharing their ideas of where Iran should go and what is happening. So I think this information revolution is perhaps even more revolutionary in some ways than the original, in terms of the fact that they do know. One other anecdote, 2005, I think it was, I was on my way to Iran and I stopped in Paris on the way, and I noticed that a lot of Parisian women were wearing pink. It was a really big color that year. And so I bought a pink shirt, and I thought, oh, I'm so avant-garde. I hadn't hit Washington yet. I went to Tehran. Women had pink shoes, pink coats, pink purses. Why? Because they'd seen it on TV or they'd seen it in French fashion magazines, which had come to Tehran before they'd come to pokey old Washington, D.C. So, yeah, don't underestimate what people know, because they do know a great deal. Mohammad, going to come to you. We've already made clear that the role of Islam in Iran is a little strained, maybe, in terms of certainly people are not very quote-unquote religious compared to many other Middle Eastern countries. You don't see people going and praying all the time. I'm sure they do. I mean, the only time you're really conscious of Islam in a major way is during Ashura, which has its own obvious connection to Shiism and to the Iranian Revolution. How do you see the role of religion now in Iran in terms of people practicing it? How is the government using religion? Where do you see it going? Is it still really the Islamic Republic?
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara and Mohsen, for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be here on this panel. I think the argument I try to make in the book, and every opportunity I get, is that there is no really such a thing as political Islam. There is a politics of Islam, in the sense that there is no Islam or Shia Islam that is a driving force for political elites and other political actors in Iran. Rather, religious discourses are being used constantly and being reinvented, being reconstructed, and deployed. And this deployment of religion is often a reflection of what is happening in the society. And it's a very fluid concept. It's not fixed. So you look at Shia Islam in the case of Iran, up until 50s and 60s, was relatively a quietist religion. The religious establishment worked with the monarchy. They had an institutional arrangement, like what Haleh was saying, that Ayatollahi and others had some communications and a working relationship with the Shah of Iran, that the Shah was protecting the only Shia state in the world. So they respected that. And then in the 70s, Islam became a political force, not just in Iran, in the broader Middle East. So Ayatollah Khomeini began coming up with a new discourse, which eventually led to the Iranian Revolution in 79. But several things. Number one is we often hear this is the regime of Ayatollahs, but the irony is that the vast majority of the Ayatollahs opposed this regime initially. So when we talk about the clerical regime, it's not really, at least initially, it wasn't the clerical regime. Ayatollah Khomeini had difficulties bringing clerics on board. And I think one of the reasons that he imposed veiling in the first year or the second year after the revolution was to disarm the clerical opponents that he had, so basically force them to come on board. So gradually they adopted a more radical revolutionary reading of Islam, but it was his alliance with the nationalists that helped him bring about the revolution. If it was not the alliance with the nationalists, I don't think the Carter administration would have reduced its support of the Shah. I don't think the Iranian army would have become neutralized. The idea was that the Shah would be removed and everything else would be the same. But once Khomeini came to power, things changed on the ground. The leftists, who were a very, very powerful force on the streets, university campuses, high schools, they quickly came out of underground, mobilized. They had a powerful network, and they posed a threat. At that point, Ayatollah Khomeini adopted a more anti-American rhetoric. So the slogan "Death to America," in fact, started with the Iranian communists and leftists. The Iranian Islamists and Khomeini adopted that, not before, not during, in fact, after the hostage crisis. During the hostage crisis, after the U.S. Embassy occupation. So an anti-American Islam emerged. But that changed. In the 90s, gradually more reformist, more secular readings of Islam emerged, again, precisely because public sentiments had shifted. And what we see now in the past 5 to 10 years is more of a nationalistic reading of religion. And there were several, I guess, indications that nationalism was becoming the new ism. Of course, it's not just in Iran, part of the international trend. We see that in this country. We see that in Russia, in China, in Europe. The same thing, Persian nationalism is emerging as a powerful force in the country. Initially, there were events and movements here and there, particularly around the tomb of Cyrus the Great near the city of Shiraz. And security forces cracked down on those gatherings. But Iranian elites began cultivating and adopting this discourse. President Ahmadinejad was a perfect example, actually. He went from invoking, trying to expedite the return of the hidden imam, to reviving the concept of Persian nationalism and Cyrus the Great in his second term. But the question is, we're at a critical juncture, and that is this nationalism can go both ways. And I think Mohsen mentioned this earlier this morning. It could, as it is right now, go on a US-friendly course, or it could actually turn into an anti-American nationalist sentiment. We'll see. I just want to add one more thing regarding the issue of women's rights, kind of related to what I was saying also. The research arm of the Iranian parliament, Majlis, conducted actually published a report less than a year ago. And they argued that in that report, they found that about 10-15% of the women who were studied were militantly against veiling. There were about 30%, they had their good hijab. Their hijab was accepted, was good enough. About 60 to 70% were bad hijab, were badly veiled. And the argument that the report made was actually very interesting, that they are in this, of course, the majority of women, they're in this gray area, but we have to be very careful not to crack down because we would alienate them to the other side, the 10, 15%. At the same time, we should be careful about the social media because then we could, again, they could go. So we should work with them. And this explains why every once in a while, of course, there is some crackdown, but overall, the state is tolerating them because it doesn't want to radicalize them.
Yeah. It's only when you get up on top of a utility box, as happened not long ago, what was it, last year, and you take off your scarf and you wave it on a stick, right, that they have to arrest you in a way. Yeah.
Because it really undermines the very, I guess, cornerstone of the regime, because these are really brave acts and they cannot just do nothing. Yeah. And one other thing is that there have been several sociological studies conducted in Iran by Iranian social scientists, which are really interesting. Of course, we have to take them all with a grain of salt. One is that there is a rise of anti-clericalism. Yeah. And this is not necessarily new because it started in the 80s, right in the aftermath of the revolution. There were a lot of anti-cleric sentiment in Iran. But what is happening now is pretty violent. That clerics being attacked in Iranian streets. And this is not, a lot of them don't really have anything to do with the government. They are apolitical clerics, they could be an ordinary seminarian, but they are seen as a symbol of the regime and people attack them. That's one thing. The second thing is that the quality of the people's religiosity is changing. It's not that people are becoming less religious. The quality is changing in the sense that they no longer see the clerics, the senior clerics, as a source of emulation, as a model, whereas they have more direct connections, according to these reports, to, basically it's a spiritual concept. They still pray, but it's not a Sharia-based Islam. It might be a ritual-based Islam. So they may attend Ashura, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they all pray 5 times a day.
In my experience, people went to Ashura mostly to meet girls and boys and so on, and find people in the crowds, but
the same parties. And
have parties, yeah. Haleh, you wanted to interject?
Yes. The problem, I think, Barbara, was not arresting those women. The problem was giving them 20 years, 10 years of sentencing. There is a big difference between somebody protesting and you arrest that person and you give her a sermon and send her out. But then when you keep that person and give her 20 years, 10 years, that's something. And I think when we speak about isolation, we necessarily don't mean that they are not connected to the outside world or have access to the internet, Instagram, and so on. The isolation is now interpreted also as not really being physically part of the outside world. You are always virtually in touch with young people across the borders. You are not physically in touch. And if by any chance in the recent past, if you invite a group of young people for either a workshop or a conference, they immediately end up in jail. And I think that is the sense of isolation and despair you see sometimes among the younger generation, and the way they are compensated. And we have seen through the history of the Islamic Republic, around 6 months before any presidential or parliamentary election, the social sphere becomes much more easy. You see more young people together and so on. As soon as the election is over, the clampdown starts. Yeah. So that's...
let me ask, we started talking about where the politics of the country would go. One of the great disappointments of the revolution is that the state is in many ways more repressive now than it was before the revolution. If you look in terms of the number of people in prison and so on, the executions, this clearly wasn't the freedom that people expected. Do you see the government, with the exception of the virtual space and perhaps some lifestyle features which are much more liberalized now than they were before, do you see the government becoming more repressive in terms of political expression, freedom of the press, freedom of religion? We see there were some indications that they might soften up on the Baha'is recently, I saw. I don't know how long-lasting that will be. In terms of political parties, the reformist movement is essentially dead. Those who 20 years ago seemed like they were really on the cutting edge of something new, many of them are former hostage holders, quite ironic, have kind of faded from the scene. They were pretty much destroyed after 2009. Nobody is really, even if they let Mousavi and Kroubi out of prison, would people really be jumping up and down? I don't think so. So I want to pose it to all of you. Where do you see the political system going in these very basic ways in terms of human rights, freedom of expression, and true pluralism in the politics? And maybe, Mohammad, I'll start with you and I'll work our way back.
All right. I don't know if we can declare the reformists as dead in Iran. You're absolutely right. They don't have the same level of power and support that they did in '97 or even in 2009. Especially in the last year or two, they have lost a lot of credibility. When those protests started in Iran about a year and a half ago, over 80 cities, the reactions that the reformists demonstrated were quite disappointing, because a lot of them sided with the government. And now with the failure of the JCPOA, again, a lot of people see them as not necessarily a credible force who can deliver. But the fact that former President Khatami is still under a de facto house arrest, cannot come out, cannot go wherever he wants, no newspaper can publish his picture. It shows that they have some support. They have a tremendous level of support. The fact that former Prime Minister Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi are still under house arrest, and together with Zahra Rahnavard, they all show that the regime might be afraid of something. They don't want to release them. So I don't know if they are necessarily that force. I think they can come out again, they can regroup again. Next time when there's an election in Iran next year, and then parliamentary elections, and then the next presidential election, I think they will play a big role. Yes, within the government, they may not necessarily have much leverage. However, in the streets, I think they still can bring people out. So I think they still have some leverage. Especially when you compare them to other forces, alternative forces outside of Iran. You look at the monarchists have recently started again regrouping since a year ago, when Iranian protesters started chanting pro-Shah slogans, kind of symbolically coincided with the sudden appearance of the mummied body of Reza Shah. So they have been a bit more active, especially, I guess, in the United States. But they're not necessarily organized. They don't necessarily have, I think a good example of their fragmentation is the fact that Ardeshir Zahedi, the son of the son of General Zahedi, who carried the 53 coup, is not siding with them. His recent statements are kind of endorsing Iran's foreign and security policies. It shows that they don't really have the force yet. We're yet to see. It may become something, but we don't really see it yet. They have been struggling to become influential in Washington and also in Iran. So another force is the Iranian leftists, who were pretty much destroyed. A lot of them were killed, and then some of them, of course, collaborated with the regime against their competing groups. So they don't have a particularly good resume. Mm-hmm. They left. They don't have the network. They don't have the organization either. They're fragmented. They're in Europe. They have tried to reinvent themselves and come back as social democrats. But you listen to their discourse, it's still like 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's not, they don't seem to have a clear platform and agenda. So when you put all of this together, it seems that the reformists still have some leverage, but maybe not
And
as much
nothing
as
new
they
has
used to.
come.
Exactly, no,
Really
because
to replace
the
them.
regime doesn't allow anything.
What are your reflections? Is it going to become more repressive? Are we going to see the jails filled with more people with longer sentences, as Haleh points out? Although sometimes we know they give people 20 years or life and then they let them out, in 2 years or 3 years. But do you think that they're so afraid of the West toxification that's already occurred that they have to keep doing this? Does having the Trump administration in a way make it easier for them? Because when Obama was president, there was a real sort of attractiveness about the West and about the United States. People felt that Obama somehow was with them, right? With Trump, they know he's not with them in the way that Obama was. So, paradoxically, could they go easier? I'm just curious how you see the clampdowns that we see from time to time.
Well, Ambassador Limbert wrote us a great piece for IranSource, and he made this interesting point that every time we go forward with U.S.-Iran relations, something happens and pulls us back. And right now we're in that situation where we moved forward. One of the most important thing that's happened in U.S.-Iran relations was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the U.S. withdrew from last year. So that was our step forward, and now we're going backwards. And so from my work on sanctions, studies show that when there's a feel of threatening from outside, there's more repression on the inside, and it's because there's this fear of an uprising. But at the same time, we have to look at the bigger picture here. Iran's in a conundrum right now. President Hassan Rouhani made a comment just last week that this is the biggest crisis they've had in their 40 years. And the reality is, yes, international isolation, sanctions and whatnot have contributed to this over the years, but at the same time, the clerics have been in their ivory mosque for too long. And social media has played an interesting role in actually bringing that anger and focus on them. The Aghazadas, the children of the elite, have been posting online for example, one of the Iranian government officials' son lives in Venezuela. He's posting Ferrari photos and saying he has good genes. And then we've got the Iranian ambassador to Denmark's daughter-in-law is a fashion designer and model, very beautiful girl, was posting her ostentatious wedding on Instagram and her designer bags, and it got so bad, the criticism, that she had to put out a live Instagram video and explain to her haters that, oh, well, these are actually fake bags, but بقول معروف, as Iranians say, ما خر نیستیم, we're not stupid. So there's this sudden realization, and you hear these voices echoing. You have people like Faiz Rafsanjani, late former president Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani's daughter, coming out and saying, well, we need to really reassess the way we're thinking. President Hassan Rouhani said last year, right after the big protests happened, we need to really reassess what we're doing, or else we're going to end up like the Shah. That's kind of a big deal when the current president of Iran makes that association. But are people listening? Are people listening to those echoes and cries about mismanagement, corruption, and their disenchantment with the Iranian government? And so far, we really haven't seen them do much about it. I mean, we're supposed to be hearing about these reforms in the next few days that the Supreme Leader is supposed to be announcing, but we have no idea what they are. We don't know if that's just symbolic. But people really need to see tangible change. They want to see daily change they want to see change in their daily lives. They don't want to just hear nice things. They've been hearing nice things for years now. And so I think that unfortunately, unless they see that change with their own eyes, nice words aren't going to cut it. And that's where the crisis lies, especially with the pressure of sanctions and the economy crumbling. And unless throwing some guys, some sultan of coins, as they were calling the one guy, and some of these traitors in jail is nice and all, but they really want to see the higher ups in the IRGC that are being named and shamed in jail, not just some no-names we've never heard of.
Haleh, you had direct experience of the hospitality of the Ayatollahs, and so many others have. I just finished Jason Rezaian's excellent book, which I also highly recommend along with yours. This repressiveness has always been there. I mean, this is a regime that killed thousands in its first decade. Then things seemed to lighten up a little bit, but there was the serial murders, the chain murders, intellectuals were taken off and shot, dissidents arrested, killed, thrown off, balconies in student dormitories, and then the beginnings under Ahmadinejad of picking up dual nationals and arresting them for whatever reason I still have trouble trying to understand. The fact that the regime continued to arrest people even after the JCPOA. Look at the Namazis, who are still held hostage. Is this just a paranoid regime that knows that it's not popular, that feels that it has to do this in order to terrorize a fair amount of the population to stay in line? Is it going to be like this forever? What could break that cycle?
To me, the turning point was 2009, when the regime saw the children of the revolution, the children who grew up under that system. It was not our generation, not the younger generation. It was the children who were maybe 5 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old when the revolution happened. So they were indoctrinated in their schools. They were taught in the school. When they came out in the streets, in their tens of thousands, I hesitate to say million or anything, but I think that shook the regime to the core. They must have decided then and there that we either have to be brutal or we are lost. And this happened once before when there was a riot during the Khatami presidency at Tehran University, when he didn't lift a finger for them. And I remember a member of the regime saying that, these kids were left like little chickens in the dormitory and were slaughtered and killed and thrown out of that. So I think after each of these events, the regime decides to clamp down and to clamp viciously. I was taken aback when I read two statistics that in last year alone, in 2018, they arrested 7,000 people. For the life of me, I don't know where they can put these 7,000 people because the prisons are full. That is one thing. Secondly, on the average, under President Rouhani's tenure, there has been one execution a day. So that is also a statistic. So of course, I think they have become more repressive because my sense is that they feel more vulnerable. When you have somebody like Masih Ahmadinejad talking about removing your scarf, and you have 1.5 million followers, then that must worry them because it's their own children who are also taking part in this thing. And again, I honestly believe that they have become much bolder because neither the European nor the United States talks seriously about human rights violation. That is, the sense is that, okay, they don't talk, so why do we care? If you look, the arrest of a bunch of environmentalists, they served Iran. We all know that in our wildest imagination, that if you put a camera there to watch a cheetah walking at a certain time, you don't want to follow the Revolutionary Guards or what, So I just think they have decided that they are not letting any dissent as long as they cannot control that dissent. That is my sense.
Any other comments on that before we turn?
I would just add one thing, and that is, So during the nuclear negotiations, it seemed both the society and the polity polarized. And because a lot of people, and also a significant portion of the elites, were backing the negotiations, and there was this expectation that the deal, the agreement, as some of the speakers said earlier today, would lead into something bigger, a rapprochement. And this was not something just the Israelis were afraid of, or the Persian Gulf Arab countries were afraid of. It was something that Iranian hardliners were afraid of too equally, and the Revolutionary Guards. So that was a serious concern that they had. So I think as the deal moved forward, so they made sure that they cracked down, that nobody thought this was an opportunity that they could exploit for something bigger. So it kind of, in an ironic way, it changed the situation for the worse domestically. And now, as we see the deal has failed and the Revolutionary Guards are more active regionally and also domestically, again, those voices have been further, I guess, silenced. Just give you one example that human rights lawyers in Iran apparently used to use this treaty of friendship that existed between Iran and the US, which the United States recently pulled out. Using that treaty to make a case for their human rights activist clients at the Iranian courts that, because they were accused of being spies for the United States, saying that, no, because of this treaty, we're not really two enemies. Of course, this would not work. But this shows you how desperate they were to find anything that they could to use to help their clients. But yeah, as Haleh said, this is just getting worse.
I think also we have to recognize, and I realize this again, I mean, reading Jason's book after I read your book, and I don't know how many other books about people, Mazi or Bahari's, that there is a prison industrial complex in Iran, that the intelligence branch of the Revolutionary Guards has, I don't know how many hundreds of people who are assigned to, plucking certain vulnerable dual nationals or others, out of society and concocting fantastic plots that they're supposedly guilty of and putting on show trials and whatnot. So, I mean, I would love to know how many people are actually involved in this, and, what do you do with these people if they don't have this type of employment? It's the Russians have it, and we should remember also that Iran learned a lot from Russia.
And from us.
And from us, and that a lot of the Savak people who were left behind and weren't executed after the revolution went on to serve the Islamic Republic. So I guess there's never a shortage of these kinds of individuals.
Their mode of interrogation was very much the East German Stasi, since I had studied the Stasi very closely, so I was very much taken aback, and I could always guess what their next question is going to be and where they are going to lead to. So,
With that, we have some time for some questions from the audience. I'm going to start all the way at the back. There's yes, that lady right there. Why don't you give her the mic, and then we'll move forward. Yeah. Please say your name and ask a question.
Hi, I'm Leila Garagazlu. I'm 25, clearly not a child of the revolution. The only Tehran I've ever known is the one with the short rupushusari, going out to dates and sushi. But I have a lot of friends who've always stayed in Iran. They served their military service, they went to college there, they never left. Do you think there's a space for those people in the government to make a change from the inside out? Not those who've been West toxified or have studied abroad and then gone back, but the ones who truly stayed there.
That's a really good question. And maybe Mohammad and Haleh for that.
Let me just quickly say that they don't really have problems with the West toxified people. As long as you go with them, you don't question their authority, you don't challenge them, I think they should be fine with you. I think that is the issue. Ultimately, it's about whether or not, it's about power politics. So as you said, a lot of their children, and so they are pretty West toxified. So that's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you would just go along and not question their authority. The China model. Basically, do whatever they say. They give you economic freedom to some extent social freedom, but at the expense of political freedom. I think that's the way I see it.
These people don't join the government, though, do they? Or sometimes they do. I mean, we have had some who came back. There's Kaveh Madani, for example, who's an Iranian, lives in Canada, I think now, who went back and served as a deputy minister of the environment and tried very hard, actually, to knock some sense into people, and it was then threatened with arrest and had to leave. Briefly was arrested, and had to leave. So, can the system absorb this kind of expertise? We see certainly people in the foreign ministry. The joke was there were more American PhDs on Zarif's negotiating team than there were on John Kerry's. But apart from the foreign ministry, where knowledge of English in foreign countries really matters, can these people find a role in the government of Iran?
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember the last parliamentary elections, we had an unprecedented amount of Iranian women that had gotten involved. And I remember the pictures that they had put out, and they were full of makeup, very attractive women. And I remember in the past, you had to be very conservative in your pictures. And I think that was almost a testament to the way that the type of people that were thinking about getting elected. And also on top of that, there was this more diversity. There were women that weren't involved in the establishment that were going out because they believed in their position in parliament. They thought they could make a change. They didn't have to be necessarily pro-IRI. They just wanted to make a change on a domestic level, whether it's joining Tehran City Council or the Esfahan City Council. They firmly believe, well, this is the government I've got, let me just try. And so I think we tend to look at the higher ups in the Iranian government and forget the little guys below that are doing day-to-day changes that you and I probably don't see because they don't make the Western media. At the same time, we were talking about some of these diaspora Iranians. I know quite a few that have moved back in the past few years because they believed, well, for starters, they were very hopeful about the JCPOA and they were hoping that they can help their country. And right now, they continue to live there, and they have no plans of moving back despite sanctions, despite being dual nationals. They're willing to stick it out with their fellow Iranians because they're holding on to that hope that maybe if I'm in the art scene, maybe I can bring more variety to the art in Iran abroad, or let me help build Iran's Amazon and at least help do that. And so I think these are little stories that don't make it to the headlines and we forget exist, that there are people that genuinely care about Iran and they accept that this is the government we have, but let me try to do my part. And I think this is something we often forget.
Please.
My sense is, Leila, that the private sector is a place for your friends or the people you know to start. And then, because there is a very close connection in Iran between the private sector and the public sector, because they work really hand in hand. So from the private sector, eventually they can move to the public sector, provided they don't go near the intelligence ministry nor the Ministry of Interior. They can work to what used to be the plan organization. They can be involved in planning. They can be involved in the Ministry of Housing. All these things, these are possibilities for them. That is how they can make their headway.
Very good. We'll go here to Sina in the front row, and then we'll go to you after that. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for great discussion. My question is for Mohammad mostly. You mentioned the rise of Persian nationalism. Do you think it ever died down? Its role was diminished over the course of the past 40 years. And what role does it play now in Iran's foreign policy at the moment? Thanks.
Hold that question. Let me pass the mic back to the gentleman with the beard back there, and we'll add his question on as well.
Hi, thank you all. So based on
Can you tell us your name?
My name is Kamran.
Mm-hmm.
So based on my understanding of the history, after President Khatami's 2 terms, a lot of the unfulfilled promises of his terms led to discontent, and that has been attributed to the election of the more conservative President Ahmadinejad afterwards. And now Rouhani's term has also been kind of an echo of the unfulfilled promises that Khatami brought. given, and also people who, they in this previous presidential election, a lot of the media reporting kind of made it, that I was exposed to, kind of indicated that, people are not, they're not going to be participating, they're disenchanted.
Are we going to get a hardliner
And
again?
then, exactly, but then turned out, day of, there seemed to be a surprisingly high turnout nevertheless. Given, everything that's happened, the withdrawal from the JCPOA, and of course, forecasting Iran's political future is no easy task, but given everything that's happened, what do you think will be the defining factors come the next presidential election, especially with Rouhani's second term coming to an end?
I'll start with Mohammad, and then we'll go to the others. So, role of Persian nationalism, and do we have to have a hardliner next after Rouhani?
Sure, thank you. No, I don't think I was suggesting that nationalism was dead, but it goes up and down. If you go and look at the discourse in the 70s and then 80s, nationalism was not really the dominant discourse in Iran. Very much it was like religion, Islamism, or Islam, or more specifically Islamism. I remember our textbooks changed after the revolution. Our history used to start with Cyrus the Great, suddenly changed to started with Prophet Muhammad. So there was a clear shift. But we have been seeing, as I said, this is part of I guess, larger international phenomena, that this is becoming the new ism, a powerful force. And you asked what kind of implications this has for Iran's foreign policy. So more and more we see that Iran's foreign policy makers, especially on the part of the Revolutionary Guards, that they are protecting Iran's national interests. That it used to be that they're defending the sacred shrines, right? By fighting in Syria, by fighting in Iraq. But more and more we see that internally they frame this as this is not just about protecting our Shia identity or Shia brothers. This is more about our own nation, our own country. And in the past few years, so initially that discourse didn't really have much credibility. As Mohsen said, there were about 2,000 fighters that have been killed as a result of these activities in Syria and in Iraq and other places. And the scene of having these martyrs back in Iran was not pretty. It just reminded people of the Iran-Iraq war. They didn't want to see another thing. So they kept saying that if we don't fight in Syria, if we don't fight in Damascus, we'll be fighting in Iran, we'll be fighting in Tehran. And it didn't have a lot of credibility. But now with what happened with ISIS in Iraq and several attacks inside Iran by ISIS and other groups active around Iran, Sunni groups and others, possibly backed by Saudi Arabia and others. So there is this fear that this could be real. And finally, it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of countries around Iran, smaller countries that didn't really exist until the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And now they're pretty powerful. They're pretty active. They take advantage of the U.S. security umbrella. They support a lot of groups that say, for example, UAE is very active in Yemen. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, others were very active in Syria and other places. So there is this fear that our country is not as strong as it used to be. And now with these other actors in the region, smaller countries, backed by the United States and flushed with cash, they could pose a threat to our country, to our nation. So in a way, you see that the interests of the regime and the interests of the nation kind of merging. And this is what has led to probably a gradual shift in balance of power inside Iran in favor of the Revolutionary Guard. It hasn't completely changed, but you see that trend, you see that change. And kind of use this as a segue to the next question. Again, more and more you see people say, all right, perhaps we need a person with security background who could be our next president. Somebody was mentioning earlier today that Qasem Soleimani is a very respected person in Israel and also in this town. I think at some point he was more respected, whatever that means, in Washington or in Tel Aviv than he was in Tehran. But gradually, again, you see that people say perhaps he is effective. Whether or not this is the case, I don't know. But this is at least the perception that someone like him or someone like, let's say, Mohammad Bagher Qalibaf with revolutionary backgrounds a former member of the Revolutionary Guards, former mayor of Tehran, or others, Ali Larijani and others, they could be using that kind of security background that would be, I guess, unthinkable a few years ago. I mean, this is quite remarkable that the Revolutionary Guard transitioned from a shameful actor in 2009 to a national hero in 2019. So this is a remarkable transition.
Yeah. If either of you wanted to speculate on who might be the next president of Iran, and also explain to me, not that we know who, I mean, yeah, explain to me why Ahmadinejad still gets crowds when, you know, we regard him as a disaster. Most Iranians, I thought, regarded him as a disaster. You had the 2009 protests, and yet there are videos of him going out in the countryside and people coming to see him. So what's the secret of his appeal that I'm missing?
So, as for Ahmadinejad, he was a populist president, not everybody, and everybody remembers those whatever $50 he was distributing, which made a lot of difference in a lot of people's lives. So, you know, there is that side of it. But his follower, his base, quote unquote, necessarily doesn't know or doesn't care that Iran's income during the Ahmadinejad presidency from selling the oil income was more than all the years that Iran had an oil industry, including when they started. So he was very fortunate that he had that kind of income and show his largesse. That's, I think, and he speaks also the language of the ordinary people. What is puzzling to me is that the supreme leader allows him to go and talk, but he didn't allow him to run when he wanted to run as a president. He said he went to see him and got to get a permission, and he said no. So, you know, that is, I think, the pull of Ahmadinejad, and he entertains people. He's honestly, he's an entertainer. But can I say a word of nationalism? I think we saw nationalism immediately after the revolution. If you recall, when the Iran-Iraq war started, the government, I mean, the clerical members of the regime started to undermine Nowruz, you know, which was very important for Iranian, and it's a nationalist thing. And you saw in the streets of Tehran on New Year's Day, families walking, all dressed in new clothes, children in new clothes. That was their way of saying that Nowruz is very important for us. We are. So again, during the Iran-Iraq war, it was a sense of nationalism, I think, that rallied people, regardless of whether they hated the Islamic Republic or they liked it, around the government, precisely because somebody had invaded Iran. So, and over the year, we have seen this coming. Suddenly, out of the blue sky, you see young people going all the way to Shiraz and Persepolis on and Kurosh as an anniversary and a birthday or whatever. So what is it? It's all a manifestation of their sense of nationalism. And the same people necessarily don't support Iran's involvement in Syria, in Yemen, Lebanon.
Haleh, I'll just give you one last word. Do you think you know who the next president of Iran is going to be?
Oh, wow, that's a hard one to ask. I mean, I think Iran always surprises us. I remember in 2017, Ebrahim Raisi came out of the woodwork. There was some talk about this guy, and all of a sudden, a month before the election, he had crowds, and we were all shocked. And I think that's what terrified Iranians, was that, oh, well, it looks like this guy's popular. We're going to have another Ahmadinejad on our hands. Let's get out and vote. And I think that's why we were all so shocked at the numbers on the day of the election, because Iranians had essentially learned from 2005 when they boycotted and stayed home, and the Basij and the IRGC came out and voted en masse because they saw this as an opportunity. And they ended up benefiting quite a bit under the 2 terms of the Ahmadinejad administration. So I'm hoping Iranians have learned their lesson. I think so. I mean, I don't think they necessarily have faith in their government, and that's why they're going to vote. I think for them, it's between bad or worse. So, I mean, if provided the opportunity that they would have a pragmatist or reform-like type politician, they're going to try their best to vote for that individual. Now, I mean, given the circumstances, historically speaking, we will look at Iran's domestic politics, the more they get pushed back from abroad and feel threatened, the more they take a hardline stance. And that's exactly what's happening right now. They are not cowering in the face of danger. They're not the black bear. So I think the reality here is that, I mean, there very well might be a Qasem Soleimani or a Mohsen Rezai or some sort. But I mean, right now we were reading, we had a piece the other day that said, Ali Larijani is a reformist now. And it's laughable, but he's pushing that agenda. And I mean, for all we know, we could have a so-called Ali Larijani reformist candidate in 2020, but that just gives you an idea of just how complicated it can be sometimes.
Yes.
Just quickly, Larijani actually ran, I think he was on a reformist list when he ran as for the parliament a couple of years ago. Yeah, exactly. So he reinvented himself. Yeah.
Indeed. All right, we're going to have to stop because we need a little break so they can rearrange for our last panel, which is on the economy. So thank you all for sticking with us, and one more excellent panel to come. Thank you so much. You were wonderful.